The storm rolled over the outskirts of Seattle like a furious animal unleashed from the mountains. Winds howled through the trees, bending them until their branches snapped and scattered across the empty roads. Rain fell in sheets so heavy it blurred the streetlights and turned every step into a struggle against water and mud. Cars had already abandoned the road, pulled over with their hazard lights blinking, as if they too were afraid of what was coming. The world outside seemed ready to collapse under thunder that shook the earth and lightning that split the sky. Emily Dawson pressed her backpack closer to her chest and pulled her thin jacket tighter, though it did little to shield her from the downpour. She had just finished a catering job at a wealthy home on the far side of town, one she had accepted at the last minute because the pay was double. The storm had arrived faster than expected, and when she reached the bus station, she learned that the bridge back into the city had been closed after a landslide. No buses, no taxis, no chance of finding a safe ride home. She was stranded, soaked to the bone, her sneakers heavy with water, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She looked around at the endless rows of gated estates. They rose like fortresses against the night-dark silhouettes, with trimmed lawns and iron fences that gleamed when the lightning flashed. They were beautiful but unwelcoming, the kind of houses that belonged to people who never opened their doors to strangers. Emily kept walking because she had no choice, though every step made her shiver harder. She whispered to herself that she only needed a dry corner of roof for the night, and she would leave before dawn. Her eyes caught a glow through the curtain of rain. At the end of a long stone driveway stood a mansion, its windows alive with warm golden light. The house seemed enormous, with tall glass panels, angular walls, and a sense of modern perfection that made her hesitate. What kind of man lived in a place like that? Would he even listen to someone like her? But another clap of thunder rattled the ground beneath her feet, and the rain lashed her face so hard she gasped. Her pride would not keep her alive tonight. She turned onto the driveway, her shoes slipping on the wet stones, and forced herself forward until she stood at the tall front doors. Emily hesitated, trembling with cold and uncertainty. She thought of her aunt's words earlier that day, sharp and cruel, that she would never make it on her own. Maybe this was proof she was right. But then she lifted her chin and knocked. The sound was barely audible over the storm, so she knocked again, harder this time, her fist echoing through the wood. For a moment there was nothing but the roar of wind and rain. Then footsteps approached from inside, the door opened slowly, and light spilled out onto the porch like a rescue. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad, shouldered his presence, filling the space with authority. He wore a dark sweater that clung to his frame, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been working late into the night. His eyes were sharp and assessing, and his jaw tightened as he studied her. Alexander Grant had spent his entire adult life keeping the world at arm's length. His empire in technology and real estate made him one of the most powerful men in the state, yet almost no one truly knew him. His name appeared in business magazines, his fortune was whispered about, but his private life was a vacuum. No scandals, no girlfriends, not even a single photograph of him holding hands with anyone. Among the elite of Seattle, he was a mystery, and the truth one that Alexander carried like a secret curse was that he had never shared his life with a woman. At 40, he was still untouched, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he had chosen distance. Love, intimacy, trust, all of it had been locked away after a betrayal in his youth. He believed he could live without it until this moment, standing in his doorway with rain whipping at his face and a young woman staring at him with wide, defiant eyes. Emily swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. She told him she did not want to intrude, only to find a dry place until the storm eased. For a long moment he said nothing, his silence louder than the thunder outside. The logical choice was to close the door. He never let strangers inside, yet something in her gaze unsettled him. It was not just desperation, it was pride and vulnerability woven together, a reminder of the humanity he had buried under wealth and control. Finally, Alexander stepped back, his voice low and firm as he told her to come in. Emily crossed the threshold, dripping water onto marble floors that gleamed under golden light. She clutched her backpack tighter, feeling like an intruder in another world. He closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm, but neither of them knew that what had just entered his home would change his life forever. Alexander Grant had been born into a world where expectations were as high as the glass towers his family owned in downtown Seattle. His father had been a real estate tycoon who believed in discipline above all things, and his mother was a socialite who cared deeply about appearances and reputations. From the time Alexander could walk, he was dressed in tailored clothes, marched to private schools, and told that his future was already written. He was the only child, the heir, the boy, who was never supposed to fail. Teachers praised his intelligence, classmates whispered about his wealth, and adults looked at him with envy. Yet for all his privilege, he had always felt like an outsider. He was tall, awkward, with sharp features that seemed too serious for a teenager, and instead of chasing parties or popularity, he chased grades. He loved math and engineering, could spend hours tinkering with computers, and dreamed of building something that would make him stand apart from his father's shadow. But at 17, none of that mattered. What mattered was a girl named Rachel, who had been his first crush. She was radiant blonde, the type of girl who made everyone in the hallway turn. She had smiled at him once in chemistry class, and that single smile had been enough to ignite hope in his chest. For months, he worked up the courage rehearsing lines in the mirror, writing and rewriting notes he never delivered. Finally, one afternoon in spring, when the courtyard was full of students eating lunch and the cherry blossoms were scattering in the breeze, he gathered his courage. He walked to her table, trembling but determined, and held out a simple bouquet of flowers he had bought with money he earned from tutoring. His voice cracked as he asked her if she would go to prom with him. For a moment, silence fell. Then Rachel laughed. Not the sweet laugh he had imagined, but a sharp, cruel sound that sliced through him. Her friends joined in, mocking him for thinking someone like her would ever say yes to the nerd millionaire in training. She called him pathetic, said no girl would ever want someone who spent his life behind books instead of living. She said she would rather be seen with a guy who actually had charm and confidence. And she stood up and walked away with another boy who was older, louder, and much cooler. The humiliation burned into Alexander's memory. He had stood frozen flowers still in his hand, his ears ringing with laughter as students whispered and pointed. That night, something inside him shut down. The boy who had once believed in romance died under the weight of ridicule. From that day forward, he decided emotions were a liability. He stopped chasing friendship, stopped trying to impress anyone, and instead turned every ounce of energy into building an empire. College came and he dominated. He studied computer science business and real estate, graduating with honors while launching his first startup in a cramped apartment. Within 3 years, he sold it for millions. By 25, he had reinvested that fortune into properties and technology ventures. By 30, he was a billionaire. His face appeared on magazine covers, his name became synonymous with success, and people who once ignored him now scrambled to shake his hand. Women began to circle him, attracted not by who he was, but by what he had. Models at charity events, actresses at galas, even women from his past suddenly pretending they had always admired him. But Alexander had learned his lesson. He could read the hunger in their eyes, see the calculation behind every smile, and hear the falseness in their laughter. None of them looked at him the way he secretly longed to be seen as a man, not a bank account. So he turned them all away with polite distance. Rumors began to spread. Some called him aloof. Others whispered darker things, that maybe he was incapable of intimacy. Friends tried to introduce him to dates, but he never showed interest. Business rivals mocked him as a robot, all brains and money, but no heart. Alexander did not care. To him, intimacy meant risk, and risk meant pain. He lived by numbers, by contracts, by control. Yet even as he told himself he was content, he could not escape the gnawing emptiness when the lights in his penthouse went dark and silence pressed in around him. Nights were the hardest. He would sit in his office with a glass of scotch, staring at the skyline, convincing himself he had chosen this path. He told himself that loneliness was the price of security, that walls were safer than doors. Still, there were moments when his hand would hover over his phone, tempted to call someone, anyone, just to hear a human voice. But he never did. At 40, Alexander Grant was everything his father had dreamed, and more wealthy, powerful, respected. And yet, behind the polished suits and the flawless reputation was a truth no one knew. He had never let anyone in. Not one woman had ever touched the barriers he built. Not one had ever been close enough to break the silence in his home. He was still a virgin, not out of weakness, but because of a vow he had never spoken aloud. Love was dangerous. Trust was a gamble. Intimacy was a luxury he could not afford. And so he lived year after year in a mansion that echoed with silence, believing that this was his destiny, until the night the storm arrived and a stranger knocked on his door, carrying with her the one thing he had sworn he would never face again. The chance to feel Emily Dawson had never known an easy life. She was born in a small working-class neighborhood on the south side of Seattle, where cracked sidewalks and flickering street lights told stories of hardship more clearly than words ever could. Her mother, a gentlewoman who worked double shifts as a nurse, had been her anchor, teaching her that dignity did not come from wealth, but from the way one faced adversity. When Emily was 12, her mother passed away after a sudden illness, leaving her in the care of a father who could not handle the weight of responsibility. Within a year, her father moved to Alaska, chasing unstable jobs, promising to send for her, but never following through. That was when her aunt, a sharp-tongued woman with little patience, took her in. Life under her aunt's roof was never warm. Every meal came with criticism. Every step was measured against the unspoken belief that Emily was an extra mouth to feed rather than family. Her aunt remarried, and Emily quickly learned that her new step-uncle had no interest in being a protector. He kept his distance, but tolerated her only because her aunt insisted. For years, Emily endured the whispered comments that she was a burden and the constant reminders that she owed them gratitude. By 16, she had taken her first job at a diner balancing school with late nights refilling coffee cups for truckers. She discovered she had a knack for cooking, the kind that turned simple ingredients into meals that made people pause and smile. She began taking small catering gigs, baking for neighbors, delivering meals to families who were too busy to cook. Cooking became her escape, the one place where she felt in control, where criticism melted away with the scent of butter and spices. While her friends dated boys and dreamed of wedding dresses, Emily dreamed of owning a food truck, maybe even a little restaurant, where she could serve meals that made strangers feel at home. Her aunt, however, saw none of that as admirable. She believed a woman's future depended on marrying a man who could provide, and she made sure Emily heard that opinion daily. "No one respects a woman who scrubs dishes for a living," she sneered. "You should focus on finding someone with money." Emily would bite back the urge to yell instead, lifting her chin and declaring she would never sell her independence for a roof or a last name. Those words sparked endless fights. Her aunt would slam doors. Her step-uncle would shake his head, and Emily would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if she was wrong. But every morning she woke with the same conviction: she would rather struggle on her own than live as someone else's possession. At 20, she moved out briefly, renting a room with 2 roommates. She worked 3 jobs, waited tables, and saved every penny. For a while, freedom tasted sweet. But then rent spiked. One roommate disappeared without paying their share, and Emily was forced to return to her aunt's house, humiliated but not defeated. The resentment in that household only grew stronger. By the time she was 26, she had become the black sheep of the family, the one everyone whispered about at gatherings, the one her cousins avoided, because they did not want to be caught in the storm of judgment that followed her. On the afternoon the storm rolled into Seattle, her aunt unleashed another tirade. "You are wasting your life," she spat. "Do you think anyone will respect a girl who spends her nights carrying trays? Look at you, almost 30, and nothing to show for it. You will end up alone, and it will be your fault." Emily, usually calm, finally snapped. She told her aunt she would rather be alone than chained to a man she did not love. The shouting escalated, doors slammed, and in the end Emily stormed out. With her backpack slung over her shoulder and her heart pounding in her chest, she did not know where she would go, only that she needed to breathe air that was not poisoned with contempt. It was then her phone buzzed with a call from an old friend who worked at a catering company. They were desperate. A chef had canceled at the last minute for a private banquet in one of the richest neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city. Would Emily take the job? The pay was good, more than she usually earned, and it would keep her away from the suffocating house for the night. She agreed without hesitation, not knowing that decision would alter her future. That evening she worked quietly in the kitchen of a sprawling estate, chopping, stirring, and plating dishes, while laughter floated from the grand dining hall. She stayed invisible as always, content to let her food speak for her. By the time the banquet ended, the storm outside had swelled into chaos. The roads were flooding, buses canceled, and even the caterers struggled to find rides home. Emily wrapped her damp jacket around herself and stepped into the night, determined to figure it out. She thought about her aunt's words, how she was supposedly destined for failure. Yet even in the rain, even with uncertainty pressing down on her, Emily refused to believe that. She had dignity, she had fire, and though the world had tried to silence her, she carried inside the unshakable belief that her worth was not measured by anyone else's standards. That belief would soon collide with the guarded heart of a man who had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. The banquet had ended hours earlier, but the storm only grew more violent as night deepened. Emily left the estate with her backpack clutched tight, hoping to catch the last bus back to the city. But when she arrived at the small rural station, the driver shook his head and pointed at a handwritten sign. The bridge leading into town had collapsed under a landslide, the road completely closed until further notice. There would be no buses tonight, no taxis either, and ride-sharing apps showed no available cars. She stood there under the tin roof of the station, while rain drummed so hard it echoed like gunfire. A few other stranded workers muttered curses and vanished quickly, finding rides with friends or relatives, but Emily had no one to call. Her phone battery blinked red, the signal bars nearly gone. She could not stay there all night, not with the cold creeping under her skin. Pulling her jacket closer, she walked back into the storm, her shoes slipping on mud, her breath trembling in the icy air. The streets wound between tall iron fences and manicured hedges, the homes of the wealthy rising like castles behind gates that would never open for her. Lightning illuminated rows of windows, most dark of few, glowing faintly, with the kind of warmth she knew was not meant for her. She kept moving, telling herself she only needed shelter until morning, any place dry, where she could close her eyes for a few hours. Her pride whispered she should not beg, but pride could not fight hypothermia. Her body shivered violently, hair plastered to her cheeks, water soaking through every layer of clothing. Then, through the sheets of rain, she saw it. At the end of a long stone driveway rose a mansion unlike the others. Its walls were sharp and modern glass panels reaching high, the kind of design she had only seen in magazines. But what caught her breath was the light. Warm golden light glowed from tall windows, spilling across the lawn and slicing through the storm like a promise. Emily froze. Everything about the house screamed distance, wealth, and untouchable perfection. What would they do if a stranger knocked, call security, slam the door? But another clap of thunder made her flinch, and water streamed down her spine until her teeth rattled. She looked at the glow again, at the single chance of shelter. Pride had to be swallowed if she wanted to survive the night. Step by step, she climbed the slick driveway, her shoes squeaking against wet stone, her heart hammering with both fear and determination. She reached the tall double doors, their surface sleek, and polished a brass handle, gleaming even in the dark. For a moment she simply stood there, rain sliding off her nose, her breath fogging in the cold air. She thought of her aunt's harsh voice, telling her she would never make it alone, and maybe this moment was proof. But then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her fist, and knocked. The sound was soft against the storm, so she knocked again, harder this time. 3 steady strikes that echoed into the house. Nothing. She almost turned away, shame flooding her, but then she heard footsteps, heavy, firm, deliberate. The door opened slowly, releasing a glow of golden light that poured over her like salvation. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad, shouldered his presence commanding even before he spoke. His sweater clung to his frame, his hair was slightly tousled, and his eyes were sharp, unreadable. Emily's breath caught. She had never seen someone like him in real life, someone who looked carved from discipline and power, someone who belonged to a world she could only observe from the outside. Alexander Grant looked at her as if weighing every detail. The dripping hair, the trembling lips, the pride hidden behind her shivering frame. For a moment, neither moved. The rain crashing around them, the storm pressing closer as if waiting for his decision. Emily found her voice low and unsteady. She said she was stranded, that the roads were closed, and she only needed a dry place until morning. She promised she would not be a burden. His silence stretched long louder than thunder. For 20 years, Alexander had lived by strict rules. Never let strangers inside, never risk vulnerability, never open the door to trouble. Logic demanded he close it now, yet something about her eyes rooted him in place. They were not begging, not manipulative, but steady and defiant even in desperation. They reminded him of something he had not allowed himself to feel in decades, the raw pulse of humanity. Finally, Alexander stepped back. His voice was deep calm, but carried a weight that made her shiver even more. He told her to come in. Emily hesitated for half a breath, then crossed the threshold. Warmth wrapped around her instantly, the marble floors gleaming under chandelier light. The air scented faintly of cedar and smoke. She felt like an intruder in a museum, her wet sneakers squeaking on perfection. Behind her, the door shut with a final thud, sealing out the storm. She turned, clutching her backpack like a shield, and saw him watching her still, his eyes dark and unreadable. Neither knew it yet, but that simple act, a billionaire, opening his door to a stranger, would mark the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. The storm showed no mercy. By morning, the news confirmed what the bus driver had already warned. The bridge had collapsed completely, and the main road into the city was underwater. Officials said it might take several days before crews could clear the debris. Emily sat on the edge of a guest room bed, wrapped in a towel, listening to the voice of the announcer drift faintly from the television in the hallway. She had not expected to stay longer than one night, but now the reality pressed down on her. She would have to share space with a man she barely knew, a man whose presence already felt overwhelming. When she stepped into the kitchen the next morning, Alexander was already there. He moved with precision, his tall frame filling the sleek modern room as he poured black coffee into a plain mug. On the counter was a bowl of oatmeal, no sugar, no fruit, nothing to soften its blandness. Emily raised an eyebrow despite herself. That was his breakfast. He glanced at her but said nothing, only gestured toward the coffee pot as if to offer. She shook her head, then opened the refrigerator, scanning shelves lined with ingredients most people could never afford. Without asking, she pulled out eggs, bread, and bacon. Within minutes, the kitchen filled with the sound of sizzling and the smell of butter. Alexander watched her quietly, his brow furrowed, unused to anyone touching his space. She plated scrambled eggs, toast, and crispy bacon, sliding it across the counter. "You cannot live on oatmeal alone," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes firm. For the first time in years, a corner of his mouth twitched upward. He took a bite, and though he gave no verbal compliment, he finished every piece. That small victory made Emily's chest warm. The mansion itself felt like a museum, high ceilings, glass walls, and expensive art that seemed untouched by life. Emily moved carefully, respectful but curious. She found a library with shelves that stretched high volumes organized by topic and year. She ran her fingers along the spines, whispering titles she had never had the chance to read. When Alexander entered, she expected him to scold her, but instead he paused at the doorway, watching her as though she belonged there more than he did. Later that afternoon, she followed the sound of heavy thuds to a private gym. Through a glass wall, she saw him striking a boxing bag each punch, deliberate each movement controlled. Sweat clung to his temples, his muscles tight with years of discipline. Emily lingered longer than she should have, fascinated, not just by his strength, but by the restraint in every action. He noticed her eventually, their eyes locking for a heartbeat. Before she turned away quickly, cheeks flushed. The hours slipped by, with a rhythm that felt strange, yet oddly natural. She cooked small meals not because he asked, but because the silence of the kitchen demanded warmth. He let her. Sometimes they spoke briefly, exchanging polite words. Sometimes they moved through the same rooms in silence, the storm outside their constant background. Yet each silence was softer than the last, less like distance, and more like an unspoken truce. One evening, while drying the mansion's shaggy black dog, after it had come in drenched from the rain, Emily laughed. It was a small sound, but in the cavernous living room it rang out brightly. Alexander, standing nearby with a glass of scotch, froze. He could not remember the last time laughter had filled these walls. He found himself staring not at the dog, but at the curve of her smile, at the light it brought to the space. That night, as she passed the study where he worked late, she stopped at the doorway and said softly, "You always stay here until morning. That must be exhausting." He looked up from his papers, surprised by the observation, and answered without thinking, "Getting used to feeling nothing is exhausting too." He regretted the words instantly, but she only met his gaze, her expression steady, as if she understood. The storm trapped them together for 3 days. In that time, Emily moved through his mansion with a confidence he could not comprehend. She rearranged books, opened curtains, fed the dog scraps from the kitchen. She belonged where no one else ever had, and for the first time, Alexander did not feel invaded. He felt alive. The emotional distance he had built like a fortress showed cracks. He caught himself looking for her when she left a room, listening for her footsteps on the stairs. She caught herself softening whenever he spoke, her heart stumbling when his voice lowered unexpectedly. There were no declarations, no dramatic gestures, only the slow weaving of two lives forced into proximity. And yet within that quiet weaving, something dangerous was growing, something Alexander had sworn never to allow. On the 4th morning, the rain lightened, but the roads remained closed. Emily brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching rivulets of water stream through the garden. Alexander joined her silently. For a long time, they simply stood there, the mansion hushed except for the hum of the storm. Then she said almost to herself, "The world feels different after rain, like it wants us to start over." He looked at her, really looked, and for once allowed himself to imagine what starting over might mean. His chest tightened not with fear this time, but with a longing so sharp he almost stepped back. Emily turned her eyes, meeting his, and in that moment neither could pretend indifference any longer. The storm outside had trapped them, but inside another storm was rising, one of feelings too long denied and too strong to ignore. By the 5th day of the storm, the rain had finally eased, though the roads remained closed, and Alexander's mansion had shifted from a place of silence into a strange cocoon where Emily's presence was no longer foreign. But outside those walls, whispers had begun. Alexander Grant was too powerful and too watched to live his life without speculation, and the appearance of a young woman at his secluded home did not go unnoticed. The first ripple came when Victoria Hale arrived unannounced. She was 35, a venture capitalist, with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition, a woman who had built her career on being seen with the right people. For years she had believed Alexander would eventually be hers, not out of love, but out of calculation. To stand at his side would mean influence, reputation, and access to an empire. When she entered the marble foyer and saw Emily coming from the kitchen with flour on her hands and a calm confidence in her eyes, something inside Victoria burned. She smiled, but the smile was carved from ice. "And who might you be?" she asked, her tone sweet, but her gaze cutting like glass. Emily, caught off guard, but unwilling to shrink, replied evenly that she was stranded because of the storm and only helping with meals while waiting for the roads to open. Victoria tilted her head, her heels clicking against marble, as she circled like a predator. Helping with meals? How quaint. Some people know how to find opportunity in disaster. Alexander appeared from his study, his voice even but firm, as he greeted Victoria. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, making sure Emily saw, then whispered something about missing him at the last fundraiser. His expression stayed neutral, yet his eyes flicked briefly toward Emily, as if to reassure her without words. The visit was short, but its impact lingered. That night, Emily stood by the sink washing dishes while the dog lay at her feet. She told herself she should not care, that Alexander's personal life was not her concern, but the echo of Victoria's voice clung like smoke. In another part of the city, Victoria made her next move. With one phone call to a gossip columnist, she had cultivated the rumor mill began to turn. Headlines surfaced in online tabloids: "Billionaire hermit finally breaks seclusion with mystery woman." Anonymous sources speculated she was a waitress, a girl from the wrong side of town, a nobody sinking claws into a man worth billions. Social media amplified the story. Memes appeared, jokes spread, and while many dismissed it as harmless gossip, the narrative began to stain Alexander's pristine reputation. For a man whose empire depended on the trust of investors and the careful image of discipline, even whispers were dangerous. At the same time, Alexander's mother, Eleanor Grant, read the reports from her home in Boston. She had built her life around tradition, etiquette, and the belief that her son's legacy required spotless choices. Concerned calls turned into stern warnings. "Alexander, I am hearing things that cannot be ignored. A woman in your home from nowhere with no background we know of. This is not the way to protect the Grant name." Her voice was lined with steel, and though Alexander remained calm, her disapproval carried weight. Emily noticed the change in him. He grew quieter, his jaw set tighter when the phone rang. She saw newspapers arrive. At the gate, with her name twisted in gossip, she overheard him on calls defending his choices to board members who asked careful questions. Though he never directed frustration at her, Emily could feel the tension pressing into the mansion like a storm heavier than the one outside. Yet she refused to crumble. When Victoria returned with sharper words, suggesting Emily was nothing but a gold digger, Emily did not lower her gaze. She met Victoria's smirk with steady eyes and said, "Sometimes people show up, not for what they can take, but for what they can give." Victoria laughed, dismissing her, but for the first time, Alexander spoke sharply, cutting through with authority. "That is enough, Victoria." Still, the damage had been seeded. Emily could feel it in the way servants looked at her, in the way Alexander's silence deepened after long phone calls with his mother. She reminded herself she had survived worse years of being underestimated. But inside her chest, the fear gnawed that perhaps this gilded world would never allow her to stay. She had stepped into a mansion of glass, and already the cracks were beginning to spread. The pressure built slowly, but relentlessly, like the last drops filling a glass until it overflowed. By the end of the week, Emily could no longer ignore the weight of eyes that were not present, but still judged her through whispers, headlines, and accusations. The staff who delivered groceries looked at her longer than necessary. Reporters had begun lingering near the gated entrance of the estate, and Alexander's phone never stopped buzzing. His mother called again, her tone colder than before, insisting he think about reputation, legacy, and the image of his empire. Victoria, meanwhile, fanned the flames with every connection. She had leaking more rumors to the press about Emily's past, twisting her jobs as a waitress and cook into evidence that she was hunting for a wealthy husband. One evening, Emily entered the living room and heard voices drifting from Alexander's study. Victoria's was unmistakable, sharp, and laced with triumph, while Eleanor Grant's voice echoed from a speakerphone. "You cannot allow this woman to stay," Eleanor said, clipped and absolute. "She comes from nowhere, has no pedigree, no background. She is not fit for our world." Victoria added smoothly, "If she cared about you, Alexander, she would not put you in this position. She would walk away rather than risk your empire." Emily froze, her heart pounding as the words sliced through the silence. She waited, praying Alexander would respond, would defend her, would say she was more than what they assumed. But the silence stretched too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but hesitant. "I need to think." That hesitation broke her. She stepped into the room before they could say more. Her chin lifted, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "If you want to know who I am, ask me directly," she said, her voice calm despite the storm in her chest. Both Victoria and Eleanor went silent, their faces unreadable. Alexander looked at her, but in his gaze she saw conflict, not certainty. That was worse than outright rejection. She nodded once, turned on her heel, and left the study without waiting for a reply. Upstairs, she packed her few belongings with trembling hands. Her backpack felt heavier than ever, though it contained so little. She thought of the breakfasts she had made, the laughter that had echoed when she played with the dog, the quiet moments in the library when she almost believed she belonged. All of it shattered under the weight of doubt. When she descended the grand staircase, Alexander was waiting at the bottom, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Do not say anything. You already said it by saying nothing when it mattered." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she refused to let tears fall in front of him. She slung the backpack over her shoulder and crossed the marble floor. The dog whined softly, trailing her, until Alexander called it back. She did not look behind her. The front door opened with a heavy groan and cold air rushed in. Rain had begun again, not as violent as before, but steady enough to soak her within moments. She stepped into it willingly, letting the chill mask the heat of her tears. Behind her, Alexander stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the golden light of the mansion. He did not move, his hands clenched at his sides, his throat tight with words he could not speak. He watched her walk down the driveway, her small figure swallowed by the storm, the sound of rolling thunder matching the weight in his chest. When the gates closed behind her, the echo rang like finality. Emily walked for miles, her shoes caked with mud, her hair plastered to her face. Every step carried the echo of his silence, the knowledge that when it mattered most, he had not stood by her. By the time she reached the outskirts of her neighborhood, her body was exhausted, her spirit heavier still. The familiar streets greeted her with noised neon lights. From corner stores, children shouting as they splashed through puddles. Life here was messy, loud, imperfect, but it was hers. When she reached the worn front porch of her aunt's house, the older woman was waiting, arms crossed, mouth tight, with disdain. "So you are back," her aunt said. "I knew you would. Dreamers always come crawling home." Emily said nothing, brushing past her into the small bedroom that smelled of damp and dust. She set her backpack down and collapsed onto the hard mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. Tears finally spilled, hot and unrelenting, soaking her pillow, as she whispered to herself that she had been a fool to think she could step into another world. In his mansion, Alexander poured himself a glass of scotch, but could not drink it. He wandered through the empty rooms, each one echoing louder, now that she was gone. The library felt barren, without her humming softly while sorting books. The kitchen was sterile, without the smell of bacon and coffee. Even the dog searched for her, scratching at the guest room door where her scent still lingered. Alexander sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. For years he had believed solitude was safer, that silence was his armor. Yet now, for the first time, he felt not safety but emptiness, and it was unbearable. Emily's absence pressed heavier than her presence ever had, and in that silence he realized the truth. He had not lost control by letting her in. He had lost everything by letting her go. Alexander did not sleep that night, nor the next. He paced through the mansion like a prisoner, the echo of Emily's departure clinging to every wall. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again, the way she had stood tall, despite the tremble in her voice, the way her eyes had searched his for something he had been too afraid to give. Each time he remembered his silence, shame twisted deeper into his chest. He thought of his youth, of Rachel's laughter in the courtyard all those years ago, and realized with horror that he had repeated the same mistake. Back then, he had let others define his worth, and now he had let others define hers. The storm outside finally passed, leaving the air crisp and clear. But inside his house, the silence was heavier than ever. The dog whined at the closed guest room door until Alexander opened it, only to find the bed neatly made. The faint scent of soap and coffee lingering like a ghost. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his head bowed, and admitted to himself what he had not dared to say aloud. He missed her. Not her cooking, not her presence as an interruption, but her laughter, her defiance, her ability to see through his walls. He had pushed her away out of fear, and in doing so, He had condemned himself to the very emptiness he had always pretended to prefer. On the third day, he made a decision. He called one of his oldest employees, Ramiro, a man who had worked security for the estate for years, and who still had ties to the catering company that had hired Emily. Ramiro did not hesitate. He told Alexander the truth that Emily had taken the job at the last minute to help a friend that she had worked tirelessly through the night and that she had left with nothing but her backpack. "She is a good woman," Mr. Grant, Ramiro said firmly. "She does not deserve the lies being told about her." The words struck like thunder. The puzzle pieces snapped together. Victoria had manipulated the story, twisting Emily's independence into scandal. His mother had echoed the lies, worried more about appearances than truth. And he, Alexander Grant, a man who commanded empires, had stood silent and let it happen. He hung up the phone and called Victoria next. When she answered with a silky hello, he cut her off with a voice like steel. "I know what you did. You twisted the story and poisoned my mother against her. From this moment forward, we have no business, no friendship, no ties of any kind." Victoria tried to protest, her tone shifting from amusement to panic. "Alexander, you are overreacting. It is just gossip." "It was cowardice," he interrupted. "And it was my cowardice to let you spread it. That ends now." He ended the call without waiting for another word. Then he dialed his mother. Eleanor's voice carried its usual authority, but Alexander did not falter. "Mother," he said, "you were wrong about her. You judged her on nothing but class and background. I will not allow that kind of prejudice to dictate my life. If protecting the Grant name means losing her, then the name is worth nothing to me." His mother fell silent, shocked, but Alexander did not stay to hear her arguments. He closed the phone, grabbed his car keys, and walked out into the sunlight that had broken through after days of rain. The black SUV roared down the freeway, leaving behind the polished streets of his world and heading toward neighborhoods he had not driven through in years. Children played in puddles on cracked sidewalks, vendors called from corners, and neighbors leaned on porches, watching him curiously as his expensive car rolled past. He felt out of place, but strangely determined. He asked for directions twice before finding the faded house where she lived with her aunt. His heart pounded as he stepped out, the weight of his choice pressing into his chest. For the first time in his life, he was not walking into a boardroom or a gala, but into battle for something real. He approached the porch and knocked, not with the commanding rhythm of a man, used to doors opening automatically, but with the uncertain knock of someone who might be turned away. The door opened, and there she was, hair pulled back, eyes wary, shoulders squared, as if bracing for another wound. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat. Her arms folded across her chest. Alexander inhaled, steadying himself. "I came to say I was wrong. I let them speak lies about you. I stayed silent when I should have fought for you. I made the same mistake I made when I was 17, and I will not let it define me again." Her expression did not soften. "Why should I believe you now? You let me walk away." His throat tightened, but he did not look away. "Because I would rather have you slam this door in my face 100 times than spend one more day pretending my life means anything without you in it." The silence that followed was sharp, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in years, Alexander felt truly vulnerable, his defenses stripped bare. Whatever she chose next would either crush him or save him, but he knew he had finally done what he had never been brave enough to do before Fight for Love. The weeks that followed were a blur of whispers and stares. Though Emily allowed Alexander back into her life cautiously, the world outside their fragile reunion was merciless. Gossip blogs continued to run stories speculating about her past, twisting her independence into greed. Paparazzi parked outside her neighborhood snapping photos whenever she stepped out, reducing her to headlines. Alexander saw the toll it took, the exhaustion in her eyes, the hesitation in her laughter. That was when he made his next decision, one that would expose them both, but also silence every doubt. His annual corporate gala was approaching, a glittering event where politicians, investors, and celebrities gathered under one roof. It was the kind of stage where appearances mattered more than words, and Alexander knew that if he walked in alone, rumors would continue to fester. But if he walked in with Emily at his side, the world would be forced to see her as more than gossip. On the night of the gala, Emily stood in front of a mirror, wearing a simple navy gown he had insisted she choose herself. She refused the glittering jewels he had offered, settling only for a pair of earrings she had bought years ago from a thrift shop. Her nerves twisted as the driver opened the car door outside the Grand Hotel. Cameras flashed instantly, shouts rang through the air, and for a moment she froze, blinded by the frenzy. Alexander reached for her hand, firm and steady, and held it as if to anchor her. "Breathe," he murmured. "Just look at me." She did, and in his eyes there was no hesitation. They entered together, fingers interlaced the cameras, capturing every step. Inside, chandeliers glowed, champagne flowed, and whispers rose like a tide. Heads turned, conversations paused, and every gaze landed on the billionaire who had never once brought a date to this event, now standing with a woman from nowhere. Victoria was there, dressed in a crimson gown that clung like armor, her smile sharp with malice. She approached with the confidence of someone who thought she still had control. "Alexander," she purred, "you brought company. How unexpected." Her eyes slid to Emily, scanning her from head to toe with disdain. Emily steadied her breath, refusing to flinch. "Enjoy the night while it lasts," Victoria added, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Before Emily could reply, Alexander stepped closer, his hand tightening around hers. His voice rang clear, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "This woman is not here for my money," he said, his tone deep, unshakable. The conversations around them faltered, then fell silent. All eyes turned, the orchestra stilled, even the waiters froze. Alexander looked directly at Victoria, then at every guest in the room. "She is here because she is the only person who has ever seen me for who I am. She is the love of my life, and I will never again let anyone speak otherwise." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters scribbled furiously, and the murmur of voices rose into a storm of disbelief and awe. Victoria's face drained of color, her lips parting, but no words coming out. She had expected his silence, his compliance, but instead he had shattered her weapon in front of everyone. Emily's chest tightened, her throat thick with emotion. She had not asked for this defense, had not demanded it. Yet hearing it spoken so publicly felt like a wall crumbling inside her. For years she had been unseen, underestimated, dismissed. Now the most guarded man she had ever met was declaring her worth in front of the world. Alexander ignored the flashes, ignored the gasps, keeping his eyes on hers. I failed you once when I stayed silent. I will not fail you again. Whatever storms come, we face them together." His words struck with the force of a vow. Emily could barely breathe. The ballroom erupted into chatter, some supportive, some scandalized, but none of it mattered. In that moment, all she saw was him, the man who had once hidden behind walls, now standing bare and unashamed. Her hand trembled in his, and she whispered so only he could hear, "Then I believe you." Relief flooded his face, softening the hardness in his eyes. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, sealing his promise. Around them the world spun, with judgment and speculation, but for Alexander and Emily it was the first time silence felt like safety, not loneliness. The gala would be remembered for years, not for business deals or political speeches, but for the night Alexander Grant, the untouchable billionaire, chose love over image. And Emily, the girl from nowhere, stood at his side without flinching. The months that followed the gala were not without challenges, but the foundation had been laid in truth. For the first time, Alexander no longer lived in fear of scandal or judgment. He had faced the world head-on and declared what his heart had hidden for decades, and that choice gave him a freedom he had never known. Emily, though wary of the spotlight, found strength in the love that had been tested so publicly. She continued to work not out of necessity, but out of pride, insisting that she would never allow her identity to be reduced to a headline or a possession. Together they built something balanced, a life where she brought warmth and spontaneity into his ordered world, and he gave her stability without ever trying to cage her spirit. When they decided to marry, the ceremony was nothing like society expected. Instead of a cathedral with hundreds of guests, Alexander and Emily chose the gardens of his mansion, the same place where rain had once battered windows and lightning had split the sky. Now sunlight filtered through branches strung with simple white lights. Flowers bloomed along the paths, and a small group of family friends and loyal employees gathered in quiet joy. Emily walked down the aisle in a gown as simple as her smile, her hair loose around her shoulders, her step steady despite the emotions rising inside her. Alexander waited under an arch of roses, his eyes fixed on her with a devotion that silenced every whisper of his past. When she reached him, he took her hands, his voice steady, as he spoke the words that had lived in him since the stormy night she had first knocked on his door. "Emily, you were the storm that saved me. I thought I had everything, but I lived in silence, trapped by fear and pride. You broke through that silence not with demands or promises, but with your courage, your laughter, and your belief that even a man like me deserved a second chance. Today I choose you not as someone who fills the emptiness, but as the reason I no longer fear it." Emily's eyes shimmered as she answered, her voice soft but unwavering. "Alexander, I never dreamed my path would lead me here into a world I thought was closed to me. But from the moment you opened your door that night, I saw not a billionaire, not a name, but a man, with walls so high he could not see the sky above him. You let me in even when you were afraid, and that is why I stand here. You are the shelter I never thought I deserved. And I choose you not for what you have, but for who you are when you let yourself be seen." Their vows ended in a kiss that drew applause and tears from the small gathering. For Alexander, it was not just the sealing of a marriage, but the final collapse of every barrier he had built. For Emily, it was proof that dignity and love could coexist, that independence and belonging were not opposites, but partners. 1 year later, the mansion was filled with new sounds, not silence, but the cries of a newborn. Alexander held their child in his arms, the tiny bundle pressing against his chest, and felt a peace he had never believed possible. He sat beside Emily, who was exhausted but radiant, her hand resting against his arm. He kissed her forehead and whispered words he once would have considered weakness. "I am finally home." Emily smiled through tired eyes and whispered back, "So am I." The mansion that had once been a monument to solitude now pulsed with life, with warmth, with family. The glass walls no longer reflected emptiness, but the laughter of guests, the smell of home-cooked meals, the footsteps of a child who would grow up knowing love instead of silence. Alexander Grant, the billionaire, who had lived untouched for 40 years, had found not only intimacy, but devotion, not only passion, but partnership. And Emily Dawson, the girl who had been told she would never make it alone, had proven that storms could be survived, that dignity could lead to destiny, and that love found in the most unlikely places could change everything. To those who had doubted them, their story became legend, a reminder that money could build walls, but only love could tear them down. And for those who believed in the power of romance, their journey was proof that no storm, no gossip, no fear could stand against two hearts determined to find each other. If you believe true love conquers any storm, comment the word home.